Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, we're going to take a look at the Bitcoin mining sector for the short rankings as of June 13th. We're going to be comparing each of the individual companies against one another, and then we're going to look at the overall Bitcoin mining sector and compare it against the price of Bitcoin on the weekly and the monthly. We're also going to be looking at some key press releases that have been announced, whether it be mining updates or other updates that may or may not have impacted the share price this past week. And we'll take a look at that max pain to see where we expect market makers want to move these specific companies in the week to come. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, and starting with the far left column, you're going to see that quite a bit of these tickers are yellow, and that's because there has been some movement in this overall sector over just this past week when it comes to the short rankings. So you can see here that BTDR jumped from 4th place all the way up to number 2. They did switch places with Mara, WULF, and CleanSpark. Both remained where they were from last week. And then we see that CIFR and HUT8 also switched places on the short score rankings. And then this is a new one. Fufu and also Kango have switched places to round out the bottom of our list of 15 different companies. Moving over past that, you're going to see the price as of June 6th and also the June 13th closing price. All of the share prices that are in red means that they did close red for the day. Only Fufu actually closed green on the day. It was a rather disappointing week in terms of the price action for the Bitcoin miners, but there has been some silver lining, and we'll go over that in just a minute. But moving past that, you can see max pain. There are quite a few companies where the market makers would actually want to move the price up by the end of this coming week, and some of them would be BitDeer, currently trading at 1268, max pain at 13. CleanSpark currently trading at 930, looking to move to potentially $10. And also Riot at 972, looking to move to $10. A couple other ones would be Bitfarms at 84. Potentially, Options Chain would like to see it at $1, and Canaan at 67 cents. That would be a massive move up if they're able to get the price up to that max pain at $1. And then Hive is at $1.89. Max pain would be at $2.50. So those are just some of the companies that are actually below that max pain value. So I think we're going to be in for a very interesting week this coming week. So we'll have to see how the week ends up closing out on June 20th. But in the meantime, it's going to be exciting. Let's continue looking at some of these other metrics. You can see from the weekly, I do have a couple of these bolded here, starting at the top there, TeraWulf had a negative 8% weekly price action. BitDeer had a negative 9%. And then also Fufu had a negative 13%. So although they did close green on the day, from a weekly standpoint, they actually had the worst of the overall Bitcoin mining sector price action. And I'll go over a couple of things that I think may be happening for these different companies, and we'll see if we can figure out exactly what's going on with BitFuFu as well. We do know that they did have their earnings coming out, and I don't believe it was that great. They actually had a worse amount of EBITDA, and also their overall revenue was actually down. So that may be why we saw the overall weekly price action for BitFuFu actually going in the red. But jumping over into short value, and short percent, I do want to point out that these cells that are highlighted red mean that the short percent did decrease looking on that estimated Friday trading period compared to Thursday. And we are looking at it as of the Friday close, not including after hours. That is both for the price action and for this short interest percent. Moving over the next value, that's going to be the short value. That's going to be the overall price action times the number of shares in the free float. So pay attention to that as we get over a little bit further. That's going to give us a good idea on the overall value of this Bitcoin mining sector, and that's what we use to compare against the price of Bitcoin. And I did want to point out that the companies that did have a green share short value, and short percent mean that the actual short percent has increased when comparing Friday and Thursday trading days. And then you can see BitDeer again doesn't have a color, and that's because it traded flat in terms of short interest comparing Thursday to Friday. But moving over into the free float value, and then that weekly delta for free float, you're going to see some pretty significant changes starting with TeraWulf. An additional 1.6 million shares has been added to the overall free float. And again, I'm getting these numbers from the Ortex data. Moving down a little bit further, you're going to see that CIFR actually has a negative 360,000 shares. So they did actually reduce their overall short percent. And you can see on the weekly short percent for CIFR, it is actually up by 1.96%. So that's actually pretty interesting. They ended up reducing their overall free float. However, the weekly short percent actually increased here for CIFR. So pay attention to them over the next week or so. I'm going to be interested to see if that short percent continues to increase or if this was just a strange week for CIFR. But moving a little bit further down, I want to talk about some of these larger changes. Let's at first look at Digital BTBT. They had 750,000 shares get added to the free float. So again, anytime that these shares are being added, this would be a form of dilution for these different companies. Very high for Bitfarms, with an additional 7.63 million shares being added to the overall free float. We do know that Riot was actually selling shares of Bitfarms, so I think potentially that may be impacting the overall free float as Riot sells those shares. They're getting sold back into the overall free float, in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. But moving down a little bit further, this was actually very interesting. Canaan or Canaan actually had a negative 7.47 million shares. So they had a reduction of overall free float. So that means that they've reversed some of that dilution that could have been from buyback or maybe some insider purchasing. I do think that's a rather interesting turn of events here for Canaan. And then overall, looking at the sector, you can see that there's been an additional 2.3 million shares being added to the overall free float here. And then before we move down a little bit further, the last column I want to point out is going to be the weekly short percent. And I do have a couple of these companies bolded. First, starting with the reduced amount of short percent, you're going to see here that CleanSpark actually has a reduced short percent of 2.22%. And then Mara as well with a negative 3.52% on the short percent. So I think it's very interesting that Mara and CleanSpark were shorted very heavily. They were in the top 2 or top 3 for many weeks in a row, but we are starting to see this short percent change for these specific companies and overall Bitcoin mining sector. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But moving a little bit further down, some of the other ones I want to point out, I already talked about CIFR having an increase in their short percent by 1.96. And you can actually see that they changed from number 7 to now number 6 in terms of short percent. So this change on the weekly short percent did end up bumping them up in the overall rankings. And then the last one I have bolded, that's going to be Fufu with a 1.19% increase on short interest. And I do believe this has to do with that earnings statement. So again, I don't think that they had the best earnings quarter, but that's just my opinion. Again, let me know your thoughts. And then looking at the overall Bitcoin mining sector, these 15 companies, they actually had a reduction on their short interest percent for the weekly. They reduced by 0.62%. So they were at 18.34% as an overall sector, down to 17.72%. Another key thing to look at on the weekly is going to be the change in overall free float value. So they almost changed by $1 billion. It was actually $900,349,000 or a 3.79% change in the red. So overall value for the sector has been reduced. And we'll look at the price of Bitcoin compared to this in just a minute. But before we do, let's jump down and dial in on the monthly. So again, even on the monthly, we're seeing a reduction in short interest for this overall sector by about negative 0.76. So I do think that's a positive. If you think about it, the overall shorts are reducing their positions here in this sector and potentially moving over into some other companies. As I've said before, I do personally believe that we will see some short interest percent increases in some of these Bitcoin treasury companies, the ones that are purchasing spot Bitcoin using various convertible notes or ATMs. So pay attention to those in the weeks and months to come. And then the last thing I want to point out on the monthly is the overall free float value. So you can see that for the month, it's still up. It's up by $191 million. So again, compared to billions, it's not much, but it's still holding on the monthly. And that is a 0.84% increase on the free float value when comparing just 1 month ago. Let's point out the Bitcoin changes. So you can see the price of Bitcoin on Friday, this would be for June 13th, was actually at $106,090. And then looking back 1 week, June 6th, it was $104,390. So that is an increase on the price of Bitcoin by about $1,700 or 1.6%. And then comparing that on the monthly, you're going to see that the price of Bitcoin has increased by $2,601 or a 2.5% increase. So overall, price of Bitcoin is now outpacing the Bitcoin mining sector. As I stated earlier, it has taken quite a hit on the overall pricing. But before we move over into that top 5 most shorted, I did want to give you a little bit of additional alpha here on this video, and that's going to be some additional updates from a news standpoint. We're going to be taking a look at some of the Bitcoin mined for the month, hash rate, and then just some overall notes that I did find looking through some various press releases over the past few weeks here for these companies. So the first thing I want to point out is going to be BTDR. They had a total of 196 Bitcoin mined in the month of May for a hash rate at 13.6 exahash. And then some of the notes was that they sold 1.6 exahash of their Seal Miner A2s. So they are sharing some of these sales in terms of these Bitcoin miners. And I do believe in the month of June, they are planning to sell some of those A3s. So we'll have to stick around and see if they do put some of the press release information out about those miners. So the next company I want to talk about is going to be CleanSpark. They actually mine a total of 694 Bitcoin, and they had an overall operating hash rate at the end of the month at 45.6 exahash per second. And taking a look, they did increase some of their energy contracts, so they now have 987 megawatts under contract, getting ever so close to that 1 gigawatt of power. And again, all of that power for CleanSpark is going to be utilized for the Bitcoin mining operation. So I am excited to see how they continue to add more hash rate. Are they doing it using the immersion miners, the latest and greatest in terms of efficiencies? We'll have to stick around and see. And then also from a Bitcoin holding standpoint, they last reported 12,502 Bitcoin in their treasury. But moving down a little bit further, talking about Mara, they actually mined 905 Bitcoin in the month of May, and their operating hash rate is at 58.3 exahash. That's pretty good in terms of Bitcoin mining. They are by far the leader in terms of monthly Bitcoin mine and overall hash rate. So we'll have to keep an eye on them as well as some of their competitors that are planning on getting up to 50 exahash by the end of June, just this month. And some other notes for Mara would be their amount of Bitcoin holding at 49,179. And again, just to remind you, not all of this is mined. They do purchase Bitcoin at spot pricing from time to time, and they've done that utilizing some various convertible notes or ATM offerings. So again, pay attention when you're looking at some of these Bitcoin treasury holdings. Are they made using shareholder equity or are they purely mined? And again, if you are looking at the mining, of course, to get some of these miners, these Bitcoin mining companies did use some shareholder equity, but my question is, are they done using the equity or will they continue tapping into that in the continued months to come? So keep an eye out for that. Moving down on the next one is going to be Riot. They actually mined a total of 514 Bitcoin, and they had an operating hash rate at 31.5 exahash. A couple of things to know about Riot is that they sold 1.748 million shares of Bitfarms. So as I mentioned, Bitfarms overall free float share count did increase, and that's because I do believe that Riot has been selling some of their shares into the open market. But moving down past them, let's take a look at CIFR. They mined a total of 179 Bitcoin at a 13.5 exahash per second, and they are holding, as of the end of the month in May, 966 Bitcoin. So again, pretty good news there for CIFR. They are starting to hodl some of that Bitcoin being mined, and they are selling a little bit of it to help cover some of their operations. The next couple of companies, Hunt 8, Core Scientific, no news, no mining updates. Moving down a little bit further, BTBT, no mining update, but they did have a pretty good press release I did want to highlight, and that is the White Fiber. They actually have an AI purchase of a 1 million square foot facility there in North Carolina. So it is good to see that they are starting to get some of this infrastructure purchased. Some of the CapEx, we're finally starting to see properties and infrastructure getting built. And I'm excited to see how they are able to utilize white fiber in the months to come. So moving on, let's talk about IREN. They had a total Bitcoin mine at 627 Bitcoin with a ending month hash rate at 41 exahash per second. A couple other key things to know about IREN. They actually just put out news, and this is as of June 13th is the latest update we got for this. They have a total of $550 million that were raised in the form of a convertible note. This note has a 3.5% interest rate attached, and there is a 30% premium when converting. So that means that for the 550 million, the company is actually going to get 30% less. There's going to be a discount involved. Some of the key items that they're planning on spending this money on is going to be some capped calls, as well as a pretty hefty amount of share buyback. They're planning over $90 million of shares being bought. So I do think that's really exciting and good news for IREN shareholders. They will be using, besides those capped calls and the share buyback, they'll be using the rest of that in order to help fund some of their operations, whether it be mining or whether it be AI. So I am interested to see exactly how IREN is able to leverage this money. Will they be able to get a good return on investment before the maturity date of 2029 ends up popping up? It's an interesting take. I do hope for the best for IREN. I hope they're able to really leverage this and they're able to fight off the short attack for this large note offering. And I'm hoping they're going to be able to get some pretty significant revenue generated to help maybe pay off this convertible note before the 2029 maturity so that the shareholders do not have this significant amount of equity dilution. So it's going to be interesting to see in the next couple of months and years to come for IREN. Moving past IREN, the next company is Bitfarms. No update from them. However, we did get a update from RIOT. So maybe that's the only news we'll get here from Bitfarms. That's them's going to be Canaan. Let's talk about the overall mining numbers here for Canaan. They had a total of 109 Bitcoin mined in the month of May for a hash rate of 8.75. They have a total Bitcoin holding of 1,466. Past them is going to be Hive. They had 139 Bitcoin mined in the month of May and 10.4 exahash per second. They are on track for 25 exahash by the end of this year. So we'll have to keep an eye on Hive and are they able to actually make this 25 exahash jump by the end of this calendar year. Past them is going to be Fufu, 400 Bitcoin mined in the month of May for BitFufu, and a 34.1 exahash per second. So pretty strong in terms of Bitcoin mining, and they had 1,709 Bitcoin being held. So again, not the greatest earnings, but I am seeing some strong mining numbers. Now the question is, for the amount being mined and the hash rate they have, how efficient is that hash rate? Are they going to be profitable in the months and quarters to come? We'll just have to wait and see. And the last company I want to talk about is going to be Camgo. They had a total Bitcoin mining at 484.5, had a hash rate at 32 exahash, and they had a total Bitcoin held at 3,429.3. So pretty strong mining numbers there for Camgo. And then another thing I want to point out for them, they had a share offering that was just announced. This share offering is going to get them an additional 18 exahash. That's going to put them right at 50 exahash. However, in order to be able to get these additional 18 exahash, they're going to have to use some significant amount of share dilution. So I do think it's going to be interesting to see these specific investors that are taking on the shares and providing this liquidity. Will they hold on to these and make this into a long investment, or will we see a significant amount of shares being sold and price action going downward? We'll have to wait and see, but it is an interesting turn of events. So a couple of these companies are jumping on and getting some of these convertible notes or various shareholder equity offerings going. And we are seeing some of these other companies getting some of the HPC AI stuff going. So I am excited to see. I think the next couple of months are going to be really exciting. There are quite a few companies that have commitments to hit that 50 exahash in this next month or so. So I am going to be, again, excited to see what goes on. And with the max pain numbers the way they are, I do think we may see some positive price action. I do think we'll see a bounce in the Bitcoin mining sector just based off a lot of the details that I went over today. I hope you do too. Well, let's jump now into the top 5 most shorted Bitcoin mining stocks for the week of June 13th. And coming in at number 5 on our list is going to be Riot Platforms, that is ticker symbol RIOT. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 23.9%. And this is going to be for that Thursday trading period. Comparing to 1 week ago, it was 25.45. So a significant drop in short interest for Riot. That's about a 6% drop when comparing week over week. Moving over into days of cover, that's 2.66 days, and then utilization, only 40.43%. And utilization, again, is the number of shares being shorted divided by the overall number of shares available on loan. So again, looking pretty good. A lot of shorts closing out for Riot. Moving over to short score, it's sitting at 66.27. And then taking a look at the bottom left, first I want to point out this is going to be the pricing for each of these companies, and we are looking at about a 1 month range here. If you want to take a look, please go ahead and pause. I'm not going to go into the details on the pricing, but you can see that significant drop over the last couple of days this past week. But moving over onto the right-hand side, let's talk about the live short interest data. This is the Ortex estimate for Friday, and they had a total live short interest at 23.9%. So again, a decrease when comparing Friday to Thursday trading period. And taking a look at the Interactive Brokers short availability, last reported shares available just 750,000 with the cost to borrow at 0.48%. And coming in at number 4 on our list, they were number 2 just last week. This is Mara Holdings. They have a short interest with respect to free float of 24.39%. Comparing that to just 1 week ago, it was 27.33. So a 10% drop on that short interest when comparing the percent from a week ago to just this Thursday's percent. Moving over into days to cover, currently at 2.01 days, and utilization for Mara at 74.35%. Short score, 72.06. Taking a look at that live short interest data, this is that Friday Ortex estimate data. It's at 24.36%. And again, that's that short interest with respect to free float for that Friday trading period. And again, that's a reduction on short interest when comparing to just 1 day ago on Thursday. And taking a look at the Interactive Brokers short availability, last reported shares available was just 350,000 with the cost to borrow at 0.48%. And coming in at number 3 on our list for another week in a row is CleanSpark. That is ticker symbol CLSK. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 25.49%. Comparing to 1 week ago, it was 27.83%. So an 8.41% drop on short interest when comparing this past Thursday to the Thursday prior. Looking at days to cover, currently at 2.66 days. Utilization for CleanSpark is sitting at a 76.66%. Short score is at 75.25. Live short interest data with respect to free float, this is that Ortex estimate for CleanSpark, currently sitting at 25.57%. So a slight increase on the Friday short interest with respect to free float compared to the Thursday trading period. Digging into that Interactive Brokers short availability, last reported shares available was 2.3 million with a cost to borrow at 0.5%. Coming in at number 2 on our list, they were 4 last week, is BitDR, that is ticker symbol BTDR. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 27.35%. When comparing to just 1 week ago, it was 27.62%. So a slight decrease on short interest with respect to free float for BitDR. Just so happens that Mara had a significant drop and so did CleanSpark. So because of those two companies having a drop on their short interest, it did end up pushing BitDR in the number 2 spot. Moving over into days to cover, currently at 4.97 days. Utilization for BitDR is at 100%. Short score is at 79.75. Live short interest data, this is going to be that Friday Ortex estimated short percent. It's at 27.35%. So it remained flat when looking at Friday to Thursday. And taking a look at the Interactive Broker short availability, last reported shares available just 250,000 with a cost to borrow at a pretty high 1.25%. And coming at number 1 for another week in a row is going to be TeraWulf, ticker symbol WULF. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 32.66%. When comparing it to 1 week ago, it was 32.57%. So an increase on short interest with respect to free float for TeraWulf. Moving over to days to cover, currently at 2.41 days, and utilization sitting at 66.08%. Short score is at 68.55. Moving down into the live short interest, this is at Ortex estimated data for the short percent with respect to free float, sitting at 32.64%. So a decrease on short interest with respect to free float for TeraWulf when comparing Thursday to Friday. And taking a look at the Interactive Brokers short availability, last reported shares available was 5 million shares with a cost to borrow at 0.42%. All right, and that about wraps it up for me, folks. I hope you enjoyed this rather thorough short ranking update here for the Bitcoin mining sector. Also went into some rather detail on the press releases that we saw over the last couple of weeks. Hopefully that was some good information for you all to absorb when looking at these short scores. And then also, we looked at that price of Bitcoin and compared that against the overall sector. I do believe we will see a jump up just looking at some of the max pain amounts and looking at the price of Bitcoin with these Bitcoin mining companies. So glad you stuck around. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, please consider giving the video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop me a comment. Let me know your thought on some of these press releases or on these short percent for these different companies. Love to get that feedback, and let's talk in the comments. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Keep calm, hash on, and I'll see you on the next one.